Hi, this is Roger, thanks for dropping by. Today we're going to have a talk about brassias and the Brassia Intergenerics, which you're far more likely to come across, quite honestly. One of the very famous Brassia Intergenerics is the Repotting, which is one that most people will have at least heard of, even if they haven't seen or got. Now the intergenerics are often given a specific name, but a lot of them come out of the mass production units in Europe, in the EU, Germany, and the likes of the Netherlands, and they are often unnamed because those types of production units don't want people to know. If they name it and register it, then everybody knows the units that went in to make up that intergeneric, and can therefore reproduce it, or reproduce it with slight alterations to try and improve it, therefore taking away some of their business. So they tend to either give it a trade name or they don't name it at all. They just call it Cambria or orchid or houseplant, as they do. But yeah, the brassias are in the Oncidium alliance, and they do mix quite well. They seem to mix readily with Miltonias, also obviously in the Oncidium alliance, and directly with Oncidiums as well. Some of them are actually given a genus name, like Bratonia, which is a half Brassia and half Miltonia. Or something along those lines. Brassidium is another one, which is part Brassia, part Oncidium. And some of them are given quite convoluted names, like the one I've got here, which I'm not even going to try and remember. It'll go in the pop-up. Begins with W, that's about as much as I can remember. But it is part Brassia. Now, some of the intergenerics have more than two components. So what they might be is like a Brassia crossed with a Miltonia, so a Bratonia, but then that is then crossed with an Oncidium. So you've introduced an Oncidium with it. So that basically would be 25% Brassia, 25% Miltonia, and then 50% Oncidium. The new addition. But that addition could already be an intergeneric or a hybrid. So these can get very complicated in their makeup, and the breeding is based on trying to get a flower on a spike that is attractive, well balanced, often fragrant. A lot of the brassias are quite fragrant. They tend to have rather than a sweet fragrance, it tends to be a bit spicy, a bit tangy. Not all, but some certainly. So how do we look after brassias then? And I would say Brassia intergenerics are often the same type of care as the species brassias, because brassias are quite dominant. Now the brassias themselves come into the intermediate category. You know, you've got your cold, cool, intermediate, warm, hot. Those are your basic orchid temperature range categories. Intermediate sat in the middle, isn't it? It means they don't like to get too cold in the winter, and they prefer not to get too hot in the growing season, the summer months, if that is your growing season. So I would say they're comfortable down to about 12 degrees in the winter. If you have cooler temperatures, then they're not going to want to stay wet. They're going to need to be quite dry through those cooler temperatures. Now, if you've got those cooler temperatures at night, but quite a bit warmer during the daytime, then you might be able to water closer to normal. But if you haven't got warm daytime temperatures and it is quite cold at night, then you need to keep them quite dry. The problem with that is that will aid the roots' survival, because if you get them too wet and it's cold, the roots will rot, and that can lose you your plant. like many Oncidium types, repotting timing is quite crucial. Now, it's not necessarily time of year, but you'd have to consider that. Like now, I've got one of these here that we're going to have a look at that needs repotting, and I may miss my slot, the perfect timing, because of what my environment is currently like. When a plant slows down to almost a standstill, it's all very well saying, yes, but I've got a new growth with some roots showing. Well, if it's not going to do anything for 2 or 3 months, you're better off waiting. Yeah? And if those roots were growing as you got to the end of the summer into autumn, and you missed your time to repot, then you're better off waiting again. Because if you've got cool temperatures in the winter and it stops growing, those roots aren't going to do anything. They won't progress, they'll stall along with the rest of the plant. And then the problem you get is if you haven't got a good root system because you've disturbed it and you've repotted, and then it gets into poorer conditions where it's not actively growing, the bulbs will just shrivel because your roots aren't working properly. And once they shrivel down to an extent, they won't recover. And because the bulb, the pseudo bulb, is now half or a third of the size it should be, obviously the amount of nutrients it can hold have dropped right down. So the plant's now weak. And this is how a lot of the Oncidium types and the Intergenerics end up in collections. They end up with shriveled bulbs in a weakened state. And it's all down to timing, quite honestly. So anyway, most of the species Brassias come into the intermediate category. I think personally they do better up the warmer end of intermediate rather than the cooler end. They come from, some of them come from cloud forests, some of them come from rainforests, evergreen, some come from semi-deciduous forests. Some come from quite high up in the trees, so you'd have to have a look, do a bit of research perhaps, because if you've got one that comes from semi-deciduous forests, obviously the light levels are going to be higher. And depending on which tree it decides to grow on, the light level could be quite high. If it's a semi-deciduous tree, the leaf canopy is going to get a lot thinner. Yeah, so it could be in quite bright light. As far as light's concerned, these like good light. They're not a shade lover at all. They like pretty good light. Again, some people get away with direct sun, possibly, well, certainly winter sun won't do them any harm. And early spring, late autumn, either end of the winter, that sort of sun is probably doing them some good. You have to combine all the variables to appreciate whether the plant's going to be in a position to grow well or not. Yeah, and if it's in short days and lower light levels and cooler temperatures, it's not going to grow well. And if it's not growing well, it doesn't matter whether you've got a new growth or not, because a new growth can come out of a bulb and stop dead in its tracks. And you thought, oh, I've got a new growth, time to repot, and you'll stall the whole plant. Because it's not really an active growth. It's just that you've got a mature growth that decides to put a new growth out. But it still may not be the best time to repot. Yeah, they can be a bit finicky. And as I've said, I mean, when we have a look at some of mine, I've got one that's got nice big fat bulbs, one that's got some shriveled bulbs, one's in a bit of a state. But I've only got, I've got 2 actual brassias, a species and a hybrid, although the species is a named variety, and I have an intergeneric for us to look at. So good light, up the warmer end of intermediate. They prefer not to, I think they don't like to get too cold in the winter. And if possible, keep them growing. If you've got the temperatures and don't get such short days as perhaps we do here in the UK, then try and keep them growing. They will continuously grow if they've got the right environment. They don't come into a category that has to have a rest. Yeah? There are some plants, if they don't get that rest, they object. Well, brassias won't. If they've got good conditions, growing conditions, and you can keep those conditions going, then they'll just keep growing. And I'm sure that's how some people get a plant in a basket that big, you know, with 10 spikes hanging out all over the place. Now that's another thing to consider if you're going to go down the brassia path, is size. They can get pretty big as plants. In amongst the oncidiums are some miniatures. In amongst miltonias there are some miniatures. Amongst the brassias, the miniatures are very thin on the ground. They tend to be quite hefty plants, and their pseudobulbs are quite long, so they appear taller. I won't say fatter or bigger, but taller. They can be ribbed. Don't let that fool you into thinking they're shriveled. Some are distinctly ribbed, and that's how they are. Some are big fat plump things, but they do have this elongated tendency. Leaves can be long, bright green, a good mid-green. If they're heading towards yellow, they're possibly getting a little bit too much light. A yellowish tinge, you may get away with. If they're a deep green, the chances are they're not getting enough light. And that really goes across the board with oncidiums. You can tell the light level's okay. Obviously it doesn't happen the next day. It takes quite some time for a light level to settle in to the colour of the leaves. But as I say, you can adjust your light level by using the colour of the leaves. If they are in deep shade and they're not getting enough light, chances are they won't bloom. They do need the light to encourage the bulbs to mature properly, and then you need the strength in the plant as well as the right conditions, and they'll put out a spike. Now some brassias, and certainly in the intergenerics, you can get 2 spikes per bulb, one each side. Unlikely you'd get more than that, and a lot of the time you'll only get 1. Now, spikes. They can be up near 1 metre long, possibly even longer. They might have 10 flowers on, you might have 20. These are pretty floriferous, I think is the big long word, which before lunch is a long word. But yes, the spikes can have an awful lot of blooms on, and they line themselves up down one side of the spike and down the other side of the spike. And if the direction of your light is okay and suits it, all the ones down one side will all face one way, and all the ones down the other side will face the other way. So when you're trying to position your plant to view the spike at its best, you can only look at one side. You can't get it in a position where you can see both sides of the spike. They are quite distinctive sometimes in this positioning of the blooms relative to the spike, which runs down the middle. Yeah? They tend to be tall and arching, and not really pendulous, but they arch over. A lot of that's just to do with the sheer weight. And if it's your first one, you'll be impressed by the buds, because the buds, you get your spike, and then the buds start to form, and then the buds start to grow, and they grow, and they grow, and they grow. And you can get buds literally 3 or 4 inches long, possibly even longer. Why is that then? Well, just think about what the blooms look like. I don't call them spidery nonsense for nothing. The nickname for brassias is the spider orchids, and that's because the petals and sepals are really long, spindly, sometimes twisted, representing a spider, and the lip can be quite small, representing the body of the spider. So they have a spidery appearance. And like I've always said, your 3 sepals are effectively the bud. Well, if they're going to be 3 or 4 inches long, then so's the bud, isn't it? So the buds can be very long. And they show the patterning. because brassias do tend to have quite strong patterning on them, spotty, blotchy type patterning. They will show through the bud, so the bud will show the patterns on the sepals prior to it opening. As I've said, many are fragrant, some have quite a strong fragrance. You've got fragrance in some of the Oncidiums, some of the Miltonias. Miltoniopsis are quite fragrant. My personal view is if you introduce Miltoniopsis, you're introducing fussiness. So it might not be the best of ideas. So that's a sort of general think about brassias. The blooms are not necessarily long lasting. But if you've got a reasonable sized plant and you've got spikes coming out at different times, you can have one that can be in bloom for some considerable time. But they're not what I would call long lasting blooms. However, most of the species, the colouring, it tends to be along the creamy, greeny, pale yellowy type of colours as a base colour, and then patterning can be green spots, brown spots, reddish sort of spots. And then when you get into the intergenerics, the idea of introducing some of the Miltonias is to drive the autumn colours and the reds into that mix, therefore getting more brightly coloured blooms and reducing the overall size of the bloom. By introducing an Oncidium or a Miltonia or something else into the Brassia, you immediately shorten the sepals and petals, so it's less spidery. Yeah, the actual species Brassias really are long and thin petals and sepals. Right, so we'll have a bit of coffee before it gets too cold, and we'll have a look at my three. These are not brilliant examples, but they're what I've got. One of them was brilliant once, but it went downhill. Actually, I'm going to hold the plants up to the camera like I did the last time we did this sort of video. We'll start off with something very simple. This is what's left of my species Brassia. So this is Brassia verrucosa. And it's what's left because a lot of the plants started to rot. And I was not absolutely, but relatively certain that when I repotted it, the bits I was cutting off because they weren't, shriveled, that they were shriveled or weren't too good, it had a hint of Fusarium. So it did get treated as a just in case. The trouble is that some of the Oncidium intergenerics have got a purplish tinge to the outside of the rhizome, and it's natural, but it fools you into thinking it's got Fusarium. But if you think you might have Fusarium in an Oncidium type, just treat it. Just get a systemic fungicide, give it the treatment as per instructions, and then repeat it. And then hopefully you'll have stopped that spreading in the plant that you've already got, and new bits of the plant will grow away from it. Yeah, so I'm not going to do a big deal on that, but a lot of it comes from, if you look very carefully at the base of those leaves, look at the tinge. There's a distinct purple there, isn't there? Now that tinge can also spread onto the bulbs. It's not Fusarium, it's natural. However, although this one's got some reasonable roots, its new growth is weak. So it's not a full size new growth. However, the timing was about right because a lot of the roots did go straight down in the pot. One went straight out the bottom, and we still have some active root tips that are probably stalled now because of the cooler temperatures and the short days. Nonetheless, that plant should push on once the day lengths and the temperatures come back. It's not doing much now. This bulb is probably not going to get much bigger. It's nowhere near the size of the originals. If you ever get to Burnham's and have a look at some of their specimen versions of this species, their bulbs are half as big again as that. They're a good 6 inches long. Very tightly packed with spikes coming out. Spikes come from the base, from what I call the sheath leaf. If you have a look at this older bulb, there's nothing at the bottom of it, the leaves are at the top, and it's actually got 3 leaves coming out of the top of the pseudo bulb. If you look at this more recent one, it's got basal leaves or bract leaves or whatever you want to call them. The spikes come from down in there. So they run along the seam of the leaf and then they gradually pull away and grow away and arch over. That one's, it's doing okay, but it's not big enough to bloom. The next growth on this will be hopefully suitable to push on, feed and water well and all that, and hopefully that new growth will start early enough in the year to be able to push it on to this sort of size. If it does and it wants to bloom, then it can, but if it produces another undersized bulb that starts to bloom, I'll stop it. Let's get the strength back in the plant. So that's my species. And then next we'll have a look at this one. This came from Burnham's. They still sell this. It's a cross they've got plenty of. Again, because they've got some big specimen plants in the private area. You don't get to see them very often. And they split them up every now and again. So every now and again they've got these for sale in the nursery. Now this is a poor plant. This was repotted allegedly at the right time, and it wasn't, because it didn't take to its repot. It objected. So nearly all of these roots in this pot are old, tired and probably dead. However, the effect that that's had on the plant is to shrivel the bulbs badly. Now I think there's at least 2 plants in here. In fact, I know there's at least 2 plants in here. It needs getting out and sorting out. But if I do it now, I will probably make it worse, because it's stalled. The cooler temperatures and everything, it might look like, you know, oh well, you've got a new growth there with some roots. Oh, you've got a new growth here. There's actually another one somewhere coming out of the side of a bulb. I saw earlier, where is it? Come on, stop hiding. Oh, there's one up the middle, this one. I forgot that one. And then we've got that one. It looks like it's in active growth, but it's not. All of these growths have stalled. That new growth has been there some time and it hasn't moved. It's too cold. So it's not happy at the moment. So to repot it now could cost me the plant. So it's going to have to wait, despite the fact that the majority of the roots have died. Yeah? The amount of energy stored in that plant is not great, because the older bulbs have shriveled right back. However, this little growth here is quite plump, apart from the fact it's only half the size it should be. So, and there's a bulb here that's not too bad. It's also got leaves, so it's able to feed itself. So this will hang on long enough to get these pieces out of this pot in the spring and work out what's worth keeping and what's not worth keeping. And what I'll end up with is 1 or 2 plants like that, where I've just taken the front end off of a growth, complete with the new growth and some root activity. I've got to wait for the temperatures and the longer days to get that activity. So that's that one. It's quite a nice hybrid actually. As I said, Burnham's are still selling this, I do believe. They've still got some available. But the oldest part of this plant just needs discarding. It needs given a fresh start. That's that new growth. I knew there was one. At the very base of that bulb that I've got my finger on, but not coming out of that bulb, coming out of the one next to it. You may or may not see it. So that's that. And then last but not least, pop-up required for the name of this one, because I just can't remember it because it's convoluted. What it basically is that it was probably a Bratonia once upon a time, and then something involved in the makeup of that got reclassified to something else, so the intergeneric name became wrong. Suddenly it's not right anymore, and a new one was thought up. Don't you love them? Not. Anyway, this one has had a lot of blooms on. It was given to me as Shelob Tolkien, and Shelob Tolkien it's not, although the tag still says Shelob Tolkien. What it is what the pop-up says. It still has its last remaining spike, so we do get to look at an intergeneric Brassia hybrid. Now you can see the petals and sepals are quite long. There is a spidery look about it, although that would be classed as a pretty chunky spider, and if it came anywhere near me it would have my foot on it. I tolerate spiders in here as long as they fit on my thumbnail. They get much bigger than that, they're pushing their luck. But I am quite happy to put them outside rather than just put my foot on them. But the really big ones, they don't get a look in. I just don't like the things. So how is this one growing then? Well, this is it a single plant? I've got a feeling it might be two, looking at the way it's growing. But you can see that the older part of the plant has got some pretty sizable bulbs. Yeah? They are ribbed, they are not shriveled. If you look at the width of this bulb here, the one I'm holding at the top, it's still quite plump. However, some of them are a bit shriveled, which is why I think I may have two separate plants. Now, this is a relatively new bulb here. Whoops, bang the flower plant. And this is a trait of the Oncidium alliance that is the biggest pain in the whatnot that you have to live with. Nice new growth, miles away from the media. So the roots grow and don't reach the media, they dry out and fail before they get there. So you become reliant on the roots that are on the previous growths. If you look here, this one, this bulb here has raised up over the edge of the pot. The next growth, the one with the spike on it, is hanging over the edge of the pot. You can see all the roots, they're not going to get in the media. Yeah? So again, this one, come the spring, will get taken out of its pot, and the two front leads, that's this part of the plant here, over here, and this part of the plant here, will get split off, discard the older parts of the plant and pop them up in fresh media ready to go. This one has got some roots, but unfortunately due to timing and the time of year we're wasting these. They may start to grow again when it's repotted and they're in the media. They may start to grow again. But sometimes you get the problem where the roots, because they never made it to the media, they establish themselves as fixing and aerial roots. So if they touch something they might grab hold, but they tend to be aerial. They get their moisture through the air. They don't expect to be in the media. And if you suddenly enclose them in the media, they often fail. Yeah, but we do what we can with them. So yeah, that's my intergeneric hybrid. I did have Shelob Tolkien at one point, which is what this was thought to be, but it went to other people. For some reason or other, I was having a clear out and I decided I'd got bored with it. How stupid. I'd love to have that back again now. It has gorgeous blooms on it. Now at some point or another I've had quite a few brassias. One incredibly rare one that came from Ratcliffe's, which was the Paphiopedilum specialist nursery that closed down. It's a rude expression, but it basically closed down because one of the partners couldn't keep it in their trousers, basically. I just don't know which half was involved. I've got a feeling it might have even been both of them. But basically it was a family bust up and the nursery went down. is gone. The mum who started it all off is actually a life member of our Orchid Society and came along to our anniversary show and was presented with an award as a lifelong member. But yeah, and that was incredibly rare. And I got that when they were getting rid of their plants. The guy from Ratcliffe's, who comes to our shows quite regularly, he brought in a load of plants that they were trying to get rid of, and he said, I don't really want anything for them, I just want them to go to good homes. So what we did was we put a ticket on each plant, like a raffle ticket, and then the other half of the raffle ticket was on the door. And as people came in the door, if they were interested in having a plant, they got given a ticket. No choice, you got given a ticket. And the plant you got was the one that went with that ticket. So it saved all the arguing, and I want that one and I want this one and I can't. You just got the one you were given. And the one I was given was a very rare Brassia cross. I lost it. Basically, I tried quite a few of them on mounts. Now they do grow on mounts quite well. But the hydration in the warmer temperatures has to be constant, and even in moss, in the temperatures I used to get at the other place, watering them once a day wasn't enough. They dried out and the roots started to shrivel, so I lost quite a few as a consequence of them being mounted and the sort of temperatures I used to get at the other place. So, but that doesn't mean to say they don't grow on mounts, because they do. They can grow quite well on a mount. So there we go, that's a chat about Brassias, part of the Oncidium Alliance, endearingly known in this place as spidery nonsense. As I said, I've got one intergeneric and one hybrid and one named variety of a species. That's what I've got left. I'm happy to have more if I come across them, but given the fact that they can go downhill due to root loss, often due to being split or potted at the wrong time of year, I would only take on a new one if I could see it had good roots. So that it, you know, if you get a plant in say July, August that's got a good root system, it doesn't matter what else happens to that plant, providing you don't be silly and let the thing totally dry out in the growing season or something daft happens, it's going to survive the first winter on that root system, and then you get an additional root system from your new growths. But some of them will put up new growths at odd times, and I tend to think I'm going to take no notice of those. I used to take notice of them. Oh, I've got new growths, now's the time to repot, and those new roots will go in the new media. And you just assume that's going to happen. And when it doesn't, you sort of think, well, what went wrong then? What went wrong is you did it in November. Short days, perhaps low temperatures, it's not growing. So it doesn't matter that it's got a new growth coming out, it's producing that from the energy in the bulb, the net energy of the plant. But you're not going to be able to get any more energy into that plant and replenish its stocks if you lose your root system. So it is quite important to get your timing right. And the timing on these types, Oncidium intergenerics and the various component parts, it's not just when the new growths come, it's also new growths hopefully, but right time of year is a better bet with these. And then you get those people that I've always poo-pooed, oh, I always repot everything in the spring, and you sort of think, well, wouldn't it be better to wait for the right time, you know, when the roots are coming? Not necessarily. Sometimes the best time is the spring, even if you haven't got new growths, because you will get some soon, and they will arrive in the growing season, and the roots will get down into the media. You repot a plant when it's not far off dormant. It might have a new growth growing, but it's dormant. It's not growing actively, and it is producing that growth from stored energy rather than time of year, light levels and increase in temperatures, which is when it would normally do it. So there we go. that's a chat about the brassias. We will go into the other types in the Oncidium Alliance that I've got. Yeah, we're not doing orchids that I haven't got. So the ones we will be doing Miltonias, we will be doing Odontoglossum types, yeah, because most of the ones I've got are hybrids, but they are still Odontoglossum types. And if they hadn't reclassified them, they would still be called an Odontoglossum cross hybrid. So we'll have a look at those as separate entities. What else have I got? Brassias, Miltonias. Miltoniopsis will do, because I've got some now. One of which is not doing very well, but we work on them. I don't expect all my Miltoniopsis to do brilliantly, because they are finicky. If you've got lots of those and they grow well, then you're doing good, because they are fussy orchids. So what have we got then? We've got Miltoniopsis, Miltonias, Brassias we've done, Oncidiums obviously. So we'll come across the others and go over their differences from what I've just said. There'll be a lot of crossover, a lot of similar words when we look at the other types, except for the Miltoniopsis. They are the exception to the rule. They are cool to cold growers. They don't fit in with the others. Right, so that'll do for today. Just a word, the 8th of the month, when we do our Everything in Bloom, Bud and Spike, it has been decreed that this month it falls on a Sunday. So I will do that video on Saturday so that I can still have my Monday off. Normally I move it forward if it falls on a Sunday, but it's a normal weekend. Hannah's not coming down or anything, so we'll have a normal Sunday chat, and I will do Everything in Bloom on the Saturday. What I do for tomorrow, I don't know yet. I'll think of something, I'm sure. So that's that, and thanks for dropping by. If you haven't subscribed, it would be nice if you did so, and as always, don't forget the thumbs up. It does count, it does help the channel, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for dropping by.